I once heard about a man sitting in a cafe in Italy, looking every bit the part of the 37-year-old failure. By any standard societal metric, he was a drifter. He'd cycle through 80 different jobs, from hauling materials on construction sites to tailing subjects for a detective agency, never staying long enough to build a proper career. He was at his absolute lowest point, wandering a professional wilderness with nothing but a suitcase full of disconnected observations and a sense that he was permanently on the outside looking in. When he sat down with a high-powered book packager that day, nobody expected a masterclass in global strategy. You'd expect a man in his position to apologize for his resume or try to pivot into a more stable persona. Instead, he did something jarring. He dropped the polite mask. He began to describe the world not as we are told it works, but as he'd actually seen it. A ruthless, timeless game of perception, ego, and power played out in the shadows of every job he'd ever held. The packager didn't walk away. In fact, his eyes lit up. He realized that this man's wandering wasn't a series of failures. It was a decade-long reconnaissance mission. Those 80 random jobs weren't gaps in a resume. They were the bricks of an impenetrable fortress of insight. Most of us spend our lives trying to fit in, smoothing over our oddities and weirdness to be more marketable. We're taught that power comes from conformity and spreadsheets. But as Robert Greene discovered in that moment of desperation, the world doesn't actually reward the replaceable. It rewards the irreplaceable. It makes you wonder if the very things you're told to hide, your strange hobbies, your jagged history, and your unconventional perspective, are actually the only currency that never loses its value. Why are we all working so hard to be normal?
You know, when you look closely at that specific transition, going from sitting in that Italian cafe feeling completely obsolete to suddenly commanding the reality of the modern professional arena, you uncover this very stark, honestly, kind of uncomfortable truth about what actually constitutes value.
Exactly. Because we like to use really sanitized words when we talk about professional development.
Absolutely. We talk about, upskilling or finding your synergy or carving out your niche. But the raw currency of power, the actual currency, is skill.
Yeah.
And acquiring it is not this clean corporate process where you just click through some online training modules while sipping a latte.
Oh.
It's a brutal, visceral, literally biological event. You are physically dismantling the person you currently are to build the architecture of the person you need to become.
I think that biological reality gets completely ignored. Yeah. Like, we see the end result, the success, but we never actually look at the physical toll of that adaptation.
Yeah.
Let's look at a really concrete example of what this dismantling feels like. Consider this guy, Elias. He's a 44-year-old mid-level director at this massive logistics firm in Chicago.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. And for 15 years, Elias built his entire identity, his whole career, on very specific ways of operating. He knew the supply chain routes by heart. He managed teams using just pure interpersonal intuition, and he basically lived inside Excel spreadsheets.
The classic corporate toolkit.
Exactly. And he was highly competent in that specific paradigm. But then the environment just violently shifted. The firm decided to integrate this massive neural network-driven management system.
Wow, which is a completely different language.
Completely. Suddenly, his intuition and his Excel shortcuts just weren't enough. The system required him to understand Python scripts, predictive data architecture, machine learning models. And practically overnight, Elias felt this cold, terrifying shadow of obsolescence creeping up his neck.
And obsolescence is a profound biological stressor. I mean, it literally signals to your brain that your current survival strategies they're no longer viable. You are in danger.
And he felt it physically. Right. He's spending his nights in a dimly lit home office. It's 2 a.m. The blue light from the monitor is reflecting off his bloodshot eyes. And he is staring at these blocks of code that might as well be written in ancient Sumerian. Right. And the roughness of this process, it wasn't like a movie montage where a cool song plays and he suddenly gets it. The roughness was the humiliation.
Yeah, the ego hit.
Huge ego hit. It was the feeling of sitting in this glass-walled conference room the next day and having to send a private Slack message to a 22-year-old intern. He had to swallow his pride just to ask them to explain a basic syntax error that had kept him awake for 4 hours the night before.
That is so painful.
His brain was so comfortable in the deep, established grooves of his old routines. So he was fighting a literal physical headache. And that headache wasn't just, regular stress. It was the sensation of his aging neurons being forced to fire in patterns that they actively resisted.
Exactly.
He was in this grueling, shameful process of trying to stay relevant while his previous expertise rotted away. And when he finally mastered the system, there was no triumphant music. It was just this quiet, exhausted realization that he had survived the death of his old professional self.
Yeah, he's carrying the invisible scars of a student's deep insecurity right into that director's chair. And to understand why Elias felt that physical headache, you have to look past the Python scripts. You have to look at the neuroscience of skill acquisition.
Right, the actual biology of it.
Exactly. What Elias experienced in that dimly lit room is neuroplasticity in its rawest, most unforgiving form. You see, the human brain is a marvel, obviously, but fundamentally it is an energy conservation engine.
It wants to be efficient.
It demands strict metabolic efficiency. When you do something you already know how to do, like Elias running those logistics routes he's managed for a decade, the brain uses these established neural pathways.
Okay.
And those pathways are coded in this fatty substance called myelin. It acts just like insulation on a copper electrical wire. The thicker that myelin sheath is, the faster and more effortlessly the electrical signals travel. It requires almost zero metabolic energy.
So it's kind of like a massive, perfectly paved, multi-lane highway. You can cruise down it at 90 miles an hour. You don't even have to think about steering.
The analogy. But when Elias sat down to learn Python, he was demanding that his brain abandon that highly efficient, deeply myelinated highway.
You got to go off-road.
Completely off-road. He was forcing electrical signals into entirely uncharted, unmyelinated territory. So, sticking with your analogy, he pulled his car off the interstate and just started trying to hack his way through a dense, overgrown jungle with a dull machete. That physical headache, that was the literal metabolic cost of adaptation. The brain is suddenly consuming massive amounts of glucose and oxygen to forge entirely new synaptic connections. It actively resists this because its prime directive is efficiency. Yet the paradox here is that human survival in a shifting landscape requires this profound, energy-draining flexibility.
I want to focus on that physical sensation for a second, because if you were listening to this and you've ever found yourself trying to learn a skill that is wildly outside your comfort zone, you know exactly what that feels like.
Oh, yeah, the brain fog.
Yes, you get that dense fog. You feel this profound, heavy physical exhaustion after maybe just an hour of intense focus on something alien to you. And the crucial thing to understand here is that this exhaustion is not a sign of failure.
Not at all.
It's not a sign that you are too old or you're not smart enough or that you should just give up and stick to what you know. That physical discomfort is the literal sensation of currency being minted in your brain.
Currency being minted. And the reason this biological restructuring is so critical right now is because of the broader environment that Elias, and really everyone else, is operating within. This is the defining reality of the 21st century workplace.
Because of AI and automation?
Exactly. They aren't just automating factory lines anymore. They are systematically eradicating routine technical tasks and cognitive busy work. So the premium is no longer on being a biological machine that executes predictable processes.
Right.
The premium has shifted almost entirely to human-centric skills. We are talking about true adaptability, complex problem solving under extreme uncertainty, and really high-level emotional intelligence.
And we see this reflected in the data everywhere now. It's not just some philosophical shift. It's a measurable economic reality. You look at the hiring landscape, and 92% of hiring managers explicitly state that these adaptive, non-technical soft skills are now equal to, or even more important than, hard technical skills.
92%. That's practically universal.
And it goes deeper than just getting your foot in the door. If you look at the data from the Stanford Research Institute and the Carnegie Mellon Foundation, the numbers are just staggering. They found that 75% of long-term job success relies purely on these non-technical competencies.
Wow.
Only 25% of a person's long-term success stems from their actual technical abilities.
Which really highlights a massive systemic failure in how organizations operate today. The corporate machine completely recognizes the immense value of these adaptive skills. They know they need people who can pivot and rewire their brains like Elias did.
Sir, they write it in every job description.
Right. But the corporate infrastructure completely fails to understand how those skills are biologically built. Most corporate training operates on this one-and-done model. It treats deep behavioral adaptation the exact same way it treats, like a simple software update.
Yeah, the classic corporate retreat or the mandatory HR seminar. An employee sits in a freezing conference room for 4 hours, clicks through a 70-slide presentation, maybe does one incredibly awkward role-playing exercise.
And then management expects them to emerge completely transformed. And the biological reality proves that method is entirely useless. Operating that way results in a documented 70% memory decay almost immediately.
70% just gone.
Because a single seminar does not demand the metabolic cost required to build new myelin. It totally lacks the continuous, grueling, repetitive practice that forces actual neuroplasticity. Elias did not master the neural network system by sitting through a slide deck.
No, he suffered.
He subjected himself to sustained, repetitive failure over weeks and months. He engaged in the behavioral fluency necessary to take theoretical concepts and implement them in highly complex situations.
You know, it makes me think about orthopedics, actually.
Oh.
Let's say you break a bone in your arm, right? And you don't get it set properly. The bone heals, and on the surface, your arm might look totally fine. But the internal architecture is completely wrong. It is improperly calcified.
Why?
Because it healed wrong, it cannot bear any real weight. If you try to lift something heavy, it will just fail. Now, how does a surgeon fix that? They can't just slap a cast over it and hope it magically realigns.
You have to re-break it.
You have to physically re-break the bone. You have to shatter that improper calcification, reset the bone in the absolute correct alignment, and then force the body to endure the healing process all over again. The pain of the second break is entirely intentional, and it is entirely necessary.
That is exactly what cognitive restructuring demands. The established routines that made Elias a successful director, that was his improperly healed bone. They worked perfectly for the old environment, but they would have crippled his career in the new neural network-driven world.
He couldn't just build on top of it.
Right. He couldn't just layer new information over old habits. He had to subject himself to immense voluntary cognitive pain to undo his existing architecture. He had to shatter his old assumptions so his brain could grow back stronger and in the correct alignment.
Okay, but let's take this to the next logical step, because that structural reset provides the internal foundation. Elias built the raw skill, he paid the biological price. But raw skill operating in a vacuum is utterly defenseless.
Yes.
You can be the most highly skilled neuroplastic individual on the planet, but the world does not reward objective reality. The world rewards psychology. It rewards perception. Skill has to be shielded and it has to be projected. Which brings us out of the home office and into the absolute necessity of reputation management.
Because if you possess the currency of skill but lack the mechanism to make the market actually value that currency, you have nothing. Reputation is the interface between your internal capability and the external world.
Let's look at how this plays out in an environment where perception is literally a matter of life and death for a company. I'm talking about the hyper-curated world of Silicon Valley.
Oh, the ultimate perception game.
Exactly. Consider this founder named Sarah. She runs a highly visible tech startup. In the press, her public persona is completely flawless. She is known universally as this indomitable visionary. But behind closed doors, the objective reality is that her startup is hemorrhaging venture capital at a completely unsustainable rate. Right. The customer acquisition costs are spiraling out of control, the churn rate is terrifying, and they have massive systemic technical debt. Now, let me paint the picture of what this looks like backstage before a major tech summit. Sarah is sitting in this cold, sterile green room. She is about to give a keynote address to an auditorium packed with the exact investors she needs to keep her company alive. And the pressure is so immense that her hands are shaking violently.
Gotcha.
She has to grip the edge of the lighted vanity table just to steady herself, her knuckles turning completely white. She knows that if she goes out there and shows even a fraction of that panic, it will trigger an immediate bank run. Investors operate on herd mentality. If one smells blood, they all pull their funding.
They scatter instantly.
But Sarah understands the pillar of global strategy that Robert Greene utilized. Reputation is the foundation of power. She didn't just walk out onto that stage and project rigid, infallible strength. That would seem inauthentic in a modern context.
Perfect.
Exactly. Instead, she executed a brilliant, calculated maneuver. About halfway through her keynote, she paused, lowered her voice slightly, and intentionally admitted to a minor, highly relatable failure.
However,
she confessed that her team had missed a deadline on a specific, non-critical product feature because they were, quote, too passionate about getting the user interface perfect.
which is an incredibly sophisticated psychological shield.
It wasn't honesty, it was curation. She curated a very specific type of vulnerability. And by doing that, she humanized herself instantly. She distracted the press and the public from the massive existential financial debt her company was actually hiding.
She changed the narrative.
It was a masterclass in perception mechanics. The audience saw this courageous, transparent leader owning her truth. But in reality, Sarah was leveraging a small, heavily controlled weakness to protect the grand illusion of her absolute authority. Her power at that moment didn't come from her disastrous balance sheet. It came entirely from her ability to dictate exactly how the world was allowed to perceive her desperation.
To truly understand why Sarah's maneuver on that stage worked so flawlessly, we really have to deconstruct it using the brands as intentional agents framework.
The BIAF model.
Yes, the BIAF model. And this framework is heavily built upon the stereotype content model from social psychology. The core premise here is that human beings do not process corporate entities, startups, or even individual leaders purely as rational economic actors.
We just don't have the brain power for that.
The brain simply doesn't have the processing power to independently audit and verify the objective truth of every single entity it encounters. Instead, it relies on deep, evolutionary cognitive heuristics. We perceive entities along two distinct primal axes: intentions, which we process as warmth, and ability, which we process as competence.
Let's break those two axes down because they are the absolute lens through which the world views everything.
So when the primitive brain encounters a new entity, whether it's a person from a rival tribe thousands of years ago or a CEO on a stage today, it immediately asks two questions to ensure survival.
Okay.
The first question is, does this entity intend to harm me or help me? That is the intentions axis. We perceive good intentions as warmth, trustworthiness, and friendliness. The second question is this entity actually capable of carrying out its intention?
Like, can they actually do what they say?
That is the ability axis. We perceive ability as competence, skill, and power. And based on how an entity scores on warmth and competence, they are mapped into one of four distinct psychological quadrants.
Okay, let's map these out and look at how they define perception. What happens when an entity scores high on both?
If an entity is perceived as having high ability and high intentions, meaning they are highly competent and very warm, they land in the popular quadrant.
Okay.
The emotion they elicit from the public is admiration. Think of beloved consumer brands, perhaps a widely trusted athletic apparel company, or a local, highly successful bakery in your neighborhood. We trust them, and we know they deliver.
What about high ability, but low intentions? They are highly competent, but maybe they don't care about you at all.
That places them in the luxury quadrant, and the emotion elicited here is envy. Think of high-end sports car manufacturers or exclusive elite fashion houses. We recognize their extreme competence and the quality of their engineering, but we also know their intentions are exclusive, perhaps even elitist.
We envy them, but we don't necessarily feel a warm connection to them. And the bottom quadrants.
If an entity has low ability and low intentions,
Yeah.
so they are incompetent and perceived as having bad or selfish intentions, they land in the troubled quadrant. The dominant emotion they elicit is contempt.
Like who?
These are the companies facing massive public scandals, or engaging in predatory lending, or corporations responsible for major environmental disasters while trying to cover them up. We view them as both useless and malicious.
And the last one.
Finally, you have low ability combined with high intentions. They mean well, but they can't execute. This places them in the subsidized quadrant. The emotion elicited is pity. This is often where struggling public transport systems, underfunded government services, or well-meaning but failing local charities reside. We feel bad for them, but we don't respect their capability.
Okay, so if we take this framework and apply it to Sarah standing backstage, her hands gripping that vanity table, she knew exactly what quadrant the objective reality of her company was dragging her into.
She knew with terrifying clarity that her startup was rapidly sliding into the contempt quadrant.
Because her ability was failing.
Her actual ability to execute was failing due to the hemorrhaging capital. And she knew that if a market discovered she was hiding this massive financial failure, her intentions would instantly be viewed as deceptive and malicious. High incompetence combined with high deception equals total contempt from the market.
So she steps onto the stage, and by confessing to that minor, carefully selected flaw about being too passionate about a product feature, she forcefully manipulates the axis.
She does. She couldn't immediately fix her ability axis. The money was still gone. So she artificially spiked her intentions metric. By feigning vulnerability, she signaled massive warmth and transparency.
Oh.
She forced the audience's collective brain to pivot its perception. Instead of allowing them to discover the truth and view her with contempt, she shifted their perception toward the subsidized quadrant, eliciting pity, or even better, bridging into the popular quadrant, eliciting admiration for her perceived bravery and leadership. She completely masked her lack of actual competence by manipulating the warmth axis.
See, I have to push back on the morality of this, because while it is a brilliant psychological maneuver in the room, what happens the next day? If reputation is entirely divorced from underlying attributes, and power comes purely from managing shadows like Sarah did, are we just rewarding sociopathy and manipulation? Is objective truth completely irrelevant? If she's just hacking the audience's biological heuristics for warmth, doesn't the system eventually break? If the money is gone, the money is gone. How does managing perception actually hold up against objective reality long term?
I completely understand why it sounds like manipulation, but that is the critical intersection of perception and reality, and it is explained by the trait reputation identity model.
Okay.
This model defines personal or corporate reputation not as a reflection of objective truth, but as a consensually perceived set of individual characteristics that sustain over time within a given network. Human beings are biologically wired to use perceptions as affordances for action.
Affordances for action.
Yes. Sarah understood a fundamental law of business survival. Her actual balance sheet in that specific hour was irrelevant to her immediate survival. What mattered was runway.
Runway meaning the time she has left before the company actually dies.
Exactly. If the network, meaning the investors in the audience, the tech journalists in the front row, the broader public consensually agrees after that keynote that she's an indomitable visionary who is bravely transparent, that shared perception becomes her functional reality for a window of time.
Because they don't pull their money.
Right.
Yeah.
That reputation is an asset. Because she successfully managed that perception, the investors don't pull their funding that day. In fact, her perceived bravery might attract new funding. That gives her 6 more months of runway. She uses that 6 months to restructure the debt, fire underperforming executives, and fix the actual problems. The perception creates the literal time and space required to make the objective reality match the illusion.
Fascinating. The reputation isn't just a shield to hide behind permanently. It is a tool used to buy the time necessary to actually fix the underlying traits. It is an affordance for action.
Exactly.
But that brings us to the next massive challenge. Sarah bought herself 6 months of runway by manipulating the BIAF model. But now the clock is ticking louder than ever.
Louder.
To maintain that curated reputation and to force the underlying reality of her failing company to eventually catch up to the grand illusion she projected on stage, she cannot rely on casual effort from her team. She can't just hope they work a little harder.
No, hoping won't fix systemic debt.
You have to manufacture an environment that forces extraordinary, unprecedented execution. You have to build an architecture of urgency. You need pressure.
And not just ambient pressure, but highly structured, inescapable pressure.
Because there is a very specific, crystalline kind of clarity that only emerges when the floor is completely falling out from under you.
Yeah.
Let's look at how this pressure is weaponized in the high-stakes world of New York fintech. Consider a founder named Marcus. He operated his entire company based on what we can call the pressure chamber philosophy. He didn't just passively encounter deadlines as they naturally rose in the business cycle. He intentionally manufactured them to force his entire engineering and sales teams into a sustained state of hyper-focus.
A dangerous game.
Barry, let me set the scene for the final 48 hours before a major platform launch Marcus had scheduled. The objective reality of the code was that it just wasn't ready. There was a deeply embedded encryption bug that was compromising the security architecture.
Which is catastrophic for fintech.
Completely. The atmosphere in the office at 3 a.m. was visceral. The HVAC system was blasting, trying to keep the server rooms cool. The air literally smelled thick with the scent of ozone from the machines, stale coffee, and the unwashed bodies of engineers who hadn't been home in 2 days. Empty takeout containers were stacked on every single desk.
I've been in rooms like that. It's intense.
In the middle of this chaos, Marcus's lead developer finally reached a breaking point. The cognitive fatigue was just too much. The developer slammed his laptop shut, stood up, and threatened to walk out, declaring the bug unfixable in the time frame.
He hit his absolute limit.
Now, conventional management theory might suggest that Marcus should de-escalate, right? Offer comfort, offer an extension, tell the team to go home and sleep on it.
Yes, that would be the standard HR advice.
But Marcus did the exact opposite. He applied more weight. He looked at the lead developer and the rest of the room and coldly reminded them that this manufacturer deadline was immovable because he had already alerted the press and the key stakeholders. He told them that failure to launch wouldn't just be a minor professional setback or delayed sprint. It would be a highly public, spectacular execution of their professional reputations.
Wow, that sounds completely antithetical to modern theories of a healthy workplace culture.
It does, but it wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was the intentional, calculated use of extreme stress as a catalyst. In that 3.0 a.m. fever dream of total exhaustion, something shifted in the room.
What happened?
The team stopped overthinking. The rigid, logical pathways they had been using to try and brute force the encryption bug were exhausted. They were forced to rely on pure intuition and lateral thinking. And in that state of manufactured hyperarousal, they found a bypass for the bug that had completely eluded them for months of normal, comfortable working hours. The real insight here wasn't just that the launch was successful. The profound moment was afterward. Marcus was standing alone in the glass hallway of the office, the sun just starting to come up over the city. He could feel the sickening, heavy thud of his own heart against his ribs from the sheer adrenaline and cortisol.
The physical toll again.
Yeah. And in that moment, he realized he had traded his peace of mind for a strategic edge. He would become a man who looks at chaos and refuses to blink.
The environment Marcus engineered in that office is a textbook, albeit highly extreme, demonstration of the Yerkes-Dodson law in action.
The Yerkes-Dodson law.
Yes. This is a foundational principle in psychology that establishes an empirical relationship between physiological arousal, which we colloquially call stress, and human performance. If you look at the Yerkes-Dodson law on a graph, it maps out as an inverted U-shaped curve.
Let's trace that curve, because understanding where you sit on that curve dictates whether you succeed or collapse.
The far left side of the curve represents an environment of very low stress and low arousal. Think of a perfectly comfortable, relaxed office with no impending deadlines. Performance here is remarkably low.
Why? Because they're too comfortable.
Because of boredom, apathy, and a complete lack of biological urgency to focus. There is no metabolic incentive for the brain to execute at a high level. Now, if you move to the far right side of the curve, you have an environment of extreme, unmanageable stress. Performance here also plummets dramatically, but for a different reason.
Crippling anxiety.
Yes, panic and total cognitive overload. The brain is flooded with so much cortisol that the prefrontal cortex, the logical decision-making center, essentially shuts down, and the amygdala takes over in full fight-or-flight mode.
So you have apathy on the left and panic on the right.
Right. Peak performance resides directly at the apex of the curve, in the optimal stress zone. But the crucial, often overlooked nuance of the Yerkes-Dodson law is how it interacts with task complexity.
Things.
The optimal level of stress changes entirely depending on what you are trying to do. If the task is simple, repetitive, and requires endurance like stuffing envelopes or running on a treadmill, the brain actually benefits from extremely high arousal. You can be highly stressed and still stuff envelopes efficiently.
Sure.
But complex tasks are incredibly fragile. Tasks that demand heavy cognitive loads, creative problem solving, and lateral thinking like bypassing a multi-layered encryption bug at 3.0 a.m. require a very precise, significantly lower threshold of optimal stress. Too much stress and the creativity shatters.
Wait, if complex tasks require a lower threshold of optimal stress, then why did Marcus apply more pressure when the developer was already braking?
Yeah.
Wasn't he pushing them right into the panic zone on the far right of the curve?
He was, and that is the terrifying brilliance of his maneuver. He pushed his team right to the absolute precipice. He drove them to the very edge of impaired performance and high anxiety for a specific reason. He needed to shatter their conventional, rigid thinking patterns.
Because they were stuck.
They were stuck. Their normal cognitive architecture was failing to solve the bug. By pushing them to the brink of panic, he forced an override. He forced them past logical, step-by-step deduction into a raw state of flow and intuition. It is an incredibly dangerous game, biologically speaking, but when it works, it yields results that cannot be achieved in a state of comfort.
It makes me think of the creation of a diamond. Carbon is one of the most abundant, largely unremarkable elements on the planet. In its normal state, it's just soot or graphite. It is entirely replaceable.
Right.
It only becomes uniquely valuable. It only crystallizes into the hardest natural substance on Earth when it is subjected to immense, unnatural, crushing pressure and searing heat deep within the Earth's mantle. Marcus was providing the intense heat and the crushing pressure to force his team's cognitive carbon to crystallize into a brilliant solution.
That's exactly what he did.
But here's the functional problem with this approach. You cannot live in that 3-point arrow AM pressure chamber indefinitely. It is biological suicide. If you keep the heat and pressure on a human team constantly, they don't turn into diamonds. They just burn up into ash.
Burnout is inevitable.
The team will quit, the leaders will have heart attacks, and the company will implode. So the massive question for anyone trying to build this architecture of power is, how does a leader institutionalize that manufactured pressure without completely destroying the company in the process?
You cannot rely on ad hoc, chaotic stress. You have to structure the pressure through a rigorous operational framework. One of the most effective frameworks for this is known as the cadence, which was heavily pioneered by David Sachs.
The cadence.
The cadence solves the exact problem of burnout by institutionalizing Marcus's raw manufactured pressure into a highly sustainable, predictable, rhythmic cycle. Sachs identified that the massive chaos and burnout in a growing company almost always stems from functional silos operating on erratic, disconnected schedules.
Like engineering doing one thing and sales doing another.
Exactly. The engineering team is operating on their own timeline, the sales team is operating on theirs, and they constantly collide. To eliminate the chaos, you must synchronize the entire company around two critical overarching systems, the sales and finance system and the product and marketing system.
Let's break down the mechanics of this, because if engineering and sales are on the exact same schedule, isn't that a recipe for disaster? Engineering is trying to sprint to fix bugs, while sales is screaming at them to build new features so they can close a deal before the end of the quarter.
Which is exactly why the brilliance of the cadence is the deliberate offset. Both the sales finance system and the product marketing system operate on a strict quarterly cycle, but Sachs mandates that they're purposefully misaligned by exactly half a quarter.
Why half a quarter?
Because it creates what Sachs refers to as the lightning strike effect. A lightning strike is a major public company event, like a massive product launch or a major user conference. Events create unmovable deadlines.
You can't just push a conference back a week.
You cannot delay a conference when you've already sold tickets and booked the venue. When a public launch event is scheduled precisely for the middle of a sales quarter, it serves as an absolute forcing function for the entire company. The engineering team has a non-negotiable deadline for code freeze and quality assurance. They cannot slip because the marketing event is public. This is the manufactured pressure Marcus was using, but it is structured.
So it essentially dictates a universal rhythm for exactly what every department in the entire company is doing on any given month of the year.
Let us look at the strict quarterly rhythm under the cadence. Month 1 of the quarter is strictly for planning and kickoff. The pressure is relatively low.
Okay.
Right. Sales receives their new territories and quotas, while the engineering team begins planning the architecture for the next product iteration. Everyone is getting organized. Then comes month 2. Month 2 is the launch event. This is the lightning strike. This is the peak of the Yerkes-Dodson curve.
That's the 3.00 AM pressure chamber.
Yes. Engineering pushes the final code, marketing runs the massive event, the press releases go out, and simultaneously the sales team leverages all of that fresh press coverage and market momentum to aggressively warm up their prospects.
And month 3.
Then you transition into month 3. Month 3 is pure execution. The launch is over, the product is stabilized in the market, and the entire organization minimizes all internal meetings and distractions. Why? Because the sales team needs to ruthlessly focus on closing deals before the financial quarter ends. Engineering steps back and supports sales. The rhythm is unyielding.
And there is a very specific, almost deceptively simple structural trick regarding the actual calendar year here to make this work right.
Yes, and it is a crucial detail. Sachs mandates that companies adopt a January 31st fiscal year end rather than the standard December 31st.
Which seems trivial on the surface, but it changes the entire psychological landscape of the sales team. If you have a standard December 31st close, you are forcing your sales teams to aggressively chase highly complex deals during the absolute dead zone of the holiday season. The decision makers they need to sign the contracts are on vacation, budgets are frozen, and everyone is distracted. Furthermore, it invites massive predatory discounting from prospects. The prospects know that the vendor is desperate to hit their end-of-year numbers, so they hold out until the last week of December and demand 30% off.
They hold all the leverage.
Exactly. Shifting the fiscal year end to January 31st bypasses this structural weakness entirely. You do your heavy lifting in January when budgets are fresh and decision makers are back in the office.
It's so much smarter.
And this entire framework perfectly illustrates the danger of what Sachs calls the V2 fallacy. The V2 fallacy is the seductive trap that founders fall into when they feel the pressure mounting. They look at their messy, chaotic version 1 product, they feel the stress of the market, and there's an intense, almost overwhelming temptation to relieve that pressure by stopping the clock.
Oh, the let's rebuild trap.
Yeah. They stand up in front of the company and declare, we are going to take the next 18 months off from launching anything new. We're going to go into a cave, rebuild the entire platform architecture from scratch in comfort, and emerge with a perfect version 2.
They think they're being highly strategic and protecting their team from burnout.
But it is a fatal error. Because without the relentless pressure of a deadline, without the lightning strike forcing execution, the internal momentum of the company dies. If you measure a project in years instead of weeks or months, you will invariably be late by years. The market moves on, the sales team has nothing new to sell, and the startup dies along with the momentum. Human beings do not sprint endlessly. We burn out. But we are also terrible at running steady, monotonous, years-long marathons. We get bored and complacent. The optimal working rhythm is not a sprint or a marathon. It is a ladder. You climb a rung through intense manufactured pressure to the lightning strike, and then you step onto the platform for deliberate recovery during the planning phase. You prepare, you strike, you recover, you build the pressure, you release the pressure.
Operating at this extreme intersection of forces requires a deeply unconventional mental framework. If you are following this architecture, you are constantly enduring the biological pain of skill acquisition, you are ruthlessly managing your reputation against the heuristics of the market, and you are surviving these intense manufactured pressure cookers.
It's a lot to balance.
But all of this relies on the assumption that you are the one pulling the levers. What happens when the engineered control completely fails? What happens when you encounter a crisis where you cannot dictate the terms of the pressure and your entire framework collapses?
That brings us to the ultimate and perhaps most terrifying lesson of powerlessness. Imagine a master strategist. We're talking about a man who literally wrote the book on controlling every variable in his environment. He engineered massive political and social outcomes with a terrifying, almost mechanical precision. He possessed immense physical and intellectual dominance over his peers.
He was the ultimate architect of control.
And then suddenly an illness strikes, and he completely loses control of his own physical body to paralysis. The reality of his existence shifts overnight from total dominance to total dependence. This is a man who used his physical vitality as a weapon. Now, he cannot swim, he cannot hike, he cannot even type a letter.
The contrast is jarring.
He is forced to depend entirely on his wife and aides for the absolute simplest, most fundamental acts of human survival, from moving across a room to lifting a fork to eat a meal. Everything he relied on to exert power over the external world is violently stripped away from him.
He's left with nothing but his mind.
He is forced to stare directly into the void of the exact powerlessness he had spent decades of his life theorizing against and outmaneuvering. All of his strategy, all of his reputation management, all of his manufactured pressure is utterly useless against the biological reality of his paralyzed legs.
This devastating loss of physical agency, this total collapse of control, is the crucible for a profound psychological concept articulated by the 19th century Romantic poet John Keats.
Oh, poet.
Yes. Keats called it negative capability. In a letter to his brothers, Keats defined negative capability as the ability of a person to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. For the modern strategist or anyone navigating extreme environments, the cultivation of negative capability is the absolute highest echelon of mental discipline.
Wait, how does a concept developed by a romantic poet writing about literature apply to surviving a brutal business crisis? Or in this case, a life-altering physical paralysis? It sounds like you were just telling people to give up and accept defeat.
It is the exact opposite of giving up. When external pressure mounts beyond your capacity to manage it, when your meticulously curated reputation fails publicly, or when your skills are rendered temporarily useless by massive market forces or physical limitations, the default biological human reaction is panic.
We want to fix it immediately.
The amygdala fires, and we frantically reach for control. We try to force facts, logic, and reason onto a fundamentally chaotic and unreasonable situation. We demand answers where there are none. We exhaust ourselves fighting the reality of our powerlessness. Negative capability is the antithesis of this panicked flailing.
It's stopping the flailing.
It is the profound capacity to accept a total lack of control without breaking mentally. True mastery in life and strategy isn't just about winning a predetermined game where you know the rules, control the variables, and dictate the pace. That is easy.
Yeah.
True mastery is the agonizing process of confronting reality in all its messy, uncontrollable, devastating complexity. It requires looking directly at your own shadows, your profound vulnerabilities, and your ultimate mortality, and retaining the capacity to observe, absorb, and eventually act anyway, rather than retreating into the illusion of control.
Wow.
The strategist couldn't face his legs. But by accepting the uncertainty of his condition without irritable reaching, he retained the mental clarity to eventually conquer the geopolitical world from a wheelchair.
This brings the entire framework of this deep dive full circle. We started by looking at Robert Greene sitting in that cafe in Italy, carrying the heavy weight of his weirdness, his jagged history of 80 random jobs, and his entirely unconventional perspective on how the world works. The willingness to embrace those jagged edges, and the willingness to accept your own profound limitations, like the absolute paralysis of the strategist, is what creates true, irreplaceable power. It is the ultimate rejection of the normal.
Because normal is just a desire for control.
When you spend your entire life trying to be normal, trying to fit your resume into a perfect box, trying to avoid the headache of neuroplasticity, you are fundamentally trying to be predictable, easily understood, and perfectly in control. But reality isn't any of those things. Reality is chaotic, demanding, and utterly indifferent to your desire for a smooth path.
The architecture of power demands an alchemy of all these disparate elements we've discussed today. It is not one single tactic. It begins with the raw biological effort of someone like Elias, suffering the very real physical consequences and headaches of neuroplasticity just to remain relevant in a shifting landscape.
The biological price.
It requires the sophisticated psychological armor of someone like Sarah, manipulating the deep-seated cognitive heuristics of warmth and competence to dictate how the world perceives her survival. It necessitates the intense, fiery crucible of Marcus, institutionalizing the Yerkes-Dodson curve through the relentless, unforgiving rhythm of the cadence. And ultimately, when all of those systems inevitably break down, it relies on the complete, ego-destroying surrender of the paralyzed master strategist, wielding negative capability to survive the total collapse of his own control.
The architecture of power is fundamentally indifferent to comfort. It demands that you rewire your biology, weaponize your reputation, and step willingly into the pressure chamber. Most people will spend their entire lives smoothing out their edges to become perfectly, safely replaceable. But true mastery belongs only to those who realize the game is rigged, drop the plate mask, and forge their own irreplaceable reality.